you all for coming. My name is Ellen Chenoweth, and I'm a professor of marine biology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but I'm blessed to be based here on the Sitka campus. Thank you for coming to our Natural History Seminar series. This is a continuation of the series that was started by Kitty LaBounty and run by her for 20 years. This is our 20th year. We're really excited that Matt Goff has decided to continue that and to do it with a tribute to Kitty as well. So Kitty's somebody that, in addition to this event, has been such a huge part of our community and touched so many different aspects of life in Sitka. So thank you for coming out to celebrate her legacy here. I also want to acknowledge that we are here on Tlingit, and we're grateful for the stewardship of the Shikukwan, of all the wonderful species that we're going to learn about today. And a couple little logistics. We do have drinks and a little snack over there, so feel free to help yourself. I don't think Matt will be offended if you get up to refresh during his talk. We also have a sign-up sheet, so if you want to learn about future events and you're not on it yet, go ahead and scan the QR code to get added to the list. And then with that, I'll just introduce Matt Goff. He's our speaker today. Matt Goff is an amazing naturalist, really focused on all the incredible creatures in the Sitka area. He overlooks nothing of our environment. He is also the host of the Sitka Nature Show on KCAW, and he has a website, sitkanature.org. And he also runs the Ultimate Frisbee scene, so he's always looking for a good pickup, and he makes the young bucks look silly out there with his accurate passes. And then just one other thing, my personal gratitude to Matt for being on our State of the Sound advisory board this year for that event and helping bring in his really complete and very appreciated perspective. So without any further ado, thank you, Matt.
Well, thanks, Ellen. Yeah, so this talk came together kind of for three reasons. One of which was let's see if this will work here. There we go. One of which is, it is the 20th year. We only did 2 seminars this year, but this is, I guess, probably the last one of the 20th year. It started at Sheldon Jackson, actually. I don't know if any of you ever went to any of those. Yeah, let's see. This theoretically is supposed to be on, but it doesn't sound like it is. I don't know. Is there a button back here I didn't know to push?
It should be blue.
All right. There we go. Brennan knows how this works.
I think.
Maybe this will be better. Is that better? Yes. All right, fantastic. So, yes, 3 reasons kind of came together for this talk. One of which is that it is the 20th year. This is the 181st seminar. And in the first 13 years, there was 147 of them. Kitty and I started this. Actually, I saw a book the other day called Who Not How, and it's finding people that will do the things that you're not so good at. And so I had this idea. I wanted to do a birding seminar as a math teacher at Sheldon Jackson College. Not the typical person to do a birding seminar, but I like birds, and I thought, well, students need a 1-credit class, some of them, and we'll just do birding and have little talks every other week. And I didn't figure I was going to be organized enough to be able to manage the talks part of it, and so Kitty was teaching there at the time as well. I asked her if she'd be willing to help, and she said, sure. So that's how it started. This is a couple of posters. I made these posters. I would not make some of the same choices today, but these are a couple of the posters. One given by Andrew Tomes, the one at the top, and then this one was one that I did. Actually gave the first seminar talk of each of those years. And then Sheldon Jackson closed the following summer, and we had gotten a little bit of money from the Sitka Charitable Trust to bring in speakers, and Kitty didn't want to let that go when the college closed. So she did what needed to be done to get that money transferred and available, and then ran that seminar on her own mostly. I helped out a little bit in the background, but only just a very little bit. So most of those, until this year, most of those years were her. And we averaged kind of 11 seminars those first 13 years, then COVID hit, and that sort of shifted things, and weren't quite so many in recent years. But I'm super grateful. I'm going to reference some of these if you want to see the fuller history. That QR code up there, I wrote up a little history of the seminar, including, that's how I counted up all the seminars. I don't remember them all in my head, but I've been at most of them, and I know that some of you have been at an awful lot of them because I recognize your faces. The other reason is that I passed 3,000 species on iNaturalist. That's a lot of species. Thank you. Yeah, it's focused was a generous word. Obsessed and a little crazy might be a more accurate statement. But I thought it'd be nice to celebrate that a little bit. And then of course the third reason is Kitty. This is dedicated to Kitty, as it said on the first. But iNaturalist isn't all about me. Sitka, generally speaking, has so far, as of when I made this little this little slide, over 4,670 species that have been documented in Sitka. My guess is that's I'm guessing there's at least a couple thousand more. We've got people that are diving pretty regularly now, and so they're picking up new species all the time because there just hasn't been that much work. There's a ton of mosses and liverworts and lichens that nobody's made observations of on iNaturalist. So my guess is our total diversity here is pushing closer to 7,000 species, and maybe a lot more than that. I don't really know. It's just hard to say. So these, just in case you're curious, these here are just the most observed species. You might wonder why I have that as my most observed species, because one of the things I like to do is take pictures of the moths that show up on the wall outside where I leave a light on overnight. And so I take pictures of the moths just to document what's there. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, bald eagle is most documented. We have a lot of tourists that are using iNaturalist these days. So, and this gives a little bit of a taste of that. So 2017, some of you might remember, we did what we called the Sitka Big Ear Project. I did a talk in January that year and invited people to join iNaturalist and just observe whatever they could. In that year of kind of intentional and dedicated effort, we had around 11,000. Those numbers, it's based on the way that iNaturalist saves computing power, that those numbers at the top are basically pretty close estimates, so probably the event stats are better. But so around 11,000 observations of 1,800 species and around 85 people. That was in 2017. iNaturalist was just kind of starting to take off and get more popular. 2022, just a normal year in Sitka, 13,000 some observations, 2,200 species, over 2,200 species observed. And notice the number of observers has gone up incredibly. And so what I've noticed as I've kind of watched observations come in is that tourists like to use iNaturalist, and they're documenting their travels doing that. And then in 2025, last year, already up to 2,458 species as people, and by people I mean me in particular, but also probably some other people, continue to add their observations from photos they took but didn't post. That number will probably climb higher, but over 470 observers. So this is a general thing in iNaturalist, and as much as I like numbers, and I could spend the entire hour talking about numbers in iNaturalist, that to me is kind of the least important part of it. When you hear about 3,000 species and you go, well, that's a lot, and it is a lot. You might think I'm going all over the place. So this is a 1 mile circle. My house is inside that circle. This is just my observations. 1,847 species within that mile circle that I've observed. So you don't have to go far to start seeing a lot of different species. Some of those are birds that I only saw once, and some of them are just there, and it's kind of learning to look. Spreading out a little bit, 5 miles, jump up almost 900 more species. So this includes most of the road system. There's a little bit of Stargavin that's not here. Green Lake Road isn't here. We're starting to pick up some of the sound. To 10 miles, almost 3,000 species within 10 miles. Don't quite, just touching cruise off. Now I have all the road system. And then finally at 15 miles, this is 98% of my species are within 15 miles that I've seen. There's certainly more that are outside of that, but these are what I've observed. Now part of that's just access, right? It's hard to get places. So you see things where you're looking and not the places that you're not looking. But you know, it is interesting to me just how much diversity there is that most of us overlook. And you know, as I was thinking about what I could do for this talk, I was like, well, 3,000 species. Let's see, if I do a species a second, that'd take us the full 50 minutes or thereabouts, right? So the most boring talk ever, Kitty would rise up out of the grave and come strike me down, no doubt. So I won't do that. Instead, I'll give you I'm calling it a little bit of a sampler plate, because there's 3,000 species. There's definitely, I probably have stories for 1,500 of them or something. There's a bunch that were just sort of like I saw a bug and I took a picture and somebody put a name on it, and I don't even really remember it that well. But there's lots that I have stories to, and I can't tell all the stories. So I will share a little bit about where I got started. And if there was a starting point, this day is probably as good as any to consider that the starting point. June 4th, 1998. I do have a few pictures of things that I could tell what they were from before this, but I don't have dates on them. I had just bought myself a SLR camera. It was the first, this before digital, it was film. And this was from a hike up Gavin Hill to Harbor Mountain. And I took a bunch of pictures. Of course, iNaturalist was, 20 years really away from being a thing. But I was going to graduate school at the time, and I set up a little website. That was part of how I kept track of, or that's part of how I felt connected to home. I grew up here. My dad had taken pictures of flowers when I was a kid a little bit, and he talked more about it than he actually did it. And for whatever reason, that just stuck in my mind. I liked hiking when I was in high school, and then when I was back home in the summers for college, and I wanted to take pictures of flowers, I bought this SLR camera so I could do that. And that's what I did. And so this is the first day that I had that and went on a hike and got these pictures of flowers. And so Cooley's buttercup here. I found this flower while hiking in the Alpine on 4th of June, 1998. This plant was not very large. It has been suggested to me that the leaves make this look like a buttercup of some sort, though another person pointed out that it is not unthinkable that the flowers don't necessarily go with the leaves, which the picture puts them with. Cooley's buttercup, I didn't know what it was. I probably called it a yellow flower at the time, but this is a screen capture from my old website, which I was working on while I was in school as a way of staying connected to home, or feeling connected to home. I had no idea what that was. I was studying statistics and math, and I was in statistics classes with botany students, and I was like, botany students, they're gonna know what my plants are. I was a little bit naive about what botany students do. Turns out many of them just study plants in a lab or a particular field, and they don't know most plants. They know one plant really well. And so they were all very nice, but also not very helpful in being able to tell me this is as much information as I got. And I slowly, it kind of sunk in. I was like, oh, that's not really, my idea of botany isn't the same as what botanists actually do. So I had a Pojar and McKinnon. Maybe some of you have seen that book. It's an old field guide, has pictures. And my approach was to just look through that and look for things that matched. And so I did my best to figure that out, but I was always looking for people that might be able to tell. And from that time, in 1998, 1999, I got my first digital camera, and then all holds were off, because I like working on a computer a lot more than I like working with film. So I started taking off. The next sort of inflection point I'll mention is I had moved back here to teach at Sheldon Jackson. In spring of 2004, there was a moss workshop with Wilf Schofield. Probably few, if any of you, have heard of Wilf Schofield, but he passed away some years ago and was a giant in the field of bryology, mosses and liverworts. And he came here to do a workshop. I didn't know anything about mosses other than they were something here, and I was interested in something here. And so I signed up for this workshop. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose for me. It was way beyond my level. But what happened here, and you might wonder, why does he have pictures of flowers for a moss workshop? Because there were botanists there, and they were the kind of botanists that I was thinking about. They were field botanists, and field botanists from here. So they knew what stuff was. Mary Stensvold, who was the botanist for the Forest Service, I was asking her, because I'd met her previously, and she goes, you should meet Kitty. And so she brought Kitty over, and Kitty looked at actually these pictures. I was trying to figure out what they were. I knew they were orchids, but I didn't really know what kind. And she goes, oh, I recognize your pictures. I've been using them in class. And I said, you didn't ask? And she goes, oh, well, I'll ask from now on. So that was our first meeting over plants. And it was, she helped me a lot. She didn't do pictures as well. She could look at a herbarium, which is nonsense to me. It's like, I don't even know how to interpret that. And she knew how to work with keys. She was a trained botanist and didn't do as much with pictures. So it was an interesting dynamic over the years as I would send her pictures and she'd go, did you collect it? And I was like, well, not this time. So later that summer, she was working at the park. And this is the first, like up until this point, I'd basically been on my own, been wandering around, taking pictures of things, trying to figure out what they were. My brother and I would go out sometimes together and look at stuff. But for the most part, I wasn't really connected in with anybody else that was into this kind of thing. She was working at at Sitka Natural Historical Park that year. I think she was doing bryophyte surveys and kind of developing a checklist of mosses and liverworts for the park. And it turned out it was my birthday, not that she knew that, but it was my birthday in 2004. I walked down there, so this is a couple months after the moss workshop. She saw me and she goes, "Oh, there's Bonaparte skulls down the beach." And I'd never seen a Bonaparte skull. So that's the picture I took of a Bonaparte skull that day. And so that's the first bird that I saw here that somebody else pointed me towards. Since then, there's been a bunch of birds that people pointed me towards. In fact, in recent years, most of the new birds for me have been birds that somebody else has seen first. And I learned pretty quickly that if I wanted to see more, then it helped to have more people looking, because more eyes see more stuff. And then the other thing, I had gone and looked at the birds and got pictures of a couple other things, and I was coming back and she says, "Do you want to see something cool?" And she said, "It's goblin gold moss." And I'm like, "Okay, whatever that is." And so she took me back into the woods. There was a little tipped over stump behind the visitor center back there at the top of that little hill, and it's this. And so the bright yellow stuff there is actually kind of reflective. It's like a little reflector. There are little cells in there that capture light, and the way that they sort of gather the light makes them look like they're reflectors. And then they have these other kind of, all of the green stuff there, the darker green leafy stuff is also part of this moss. And so she showed this to me, and again, this was another first sighting for me. I'd never heard of it, and kind of started me connecting with community. So I titled this talk, "Getting to Know My Neighbors," and for me, these are the kind of, the three things that kind of braided together, if you will, and sort of mutually reinforce and encourage me. Photography, I like getting pictures of things. Nature connection, which I would say is kind of that feeling of relationship with things that I recognize, I know. It isn't just the information. The natural history is more the information. I'm also very interested in that. But it's the three of them together. Sometimes it's going and seeing something I've seen before, revisiting a tree that I remember from a past trip, and just having that sense of, "Oh, you're familiar, I recognize you." Maybe a sense of feeling like being at home, sort of thing. And natural history is tracking numbers and all of these things and information about what they're doing. And then the photography, everything, I shouldn't say everything, but most of what I've learned because I got pictures of it and then tried to figure out what it was. And so that's just my style. Everybody kind of does their own thing, but for me, it's kind of these three. So then this kind of begs the question of, who's my neighbor? Who am I actually talking about here? And so, of course, animals, the birds, cedar waxwings, deer, insects, nudibranchs, many animals, plants and other not animal things, lichens, liverworts, mosses, fungi, flowers, ferns, all the things like that. But not just that, or also large and small. Whales, trees, tiny things. 0.1 millimeters is smaller than I can see, but microscopes help. I made a decision, when I started doing this, I made a decision that there's only so much in life you can do. The world's too big. And so you kind of got to put boundaries and decide. And I just decided to put a fence around Sitka. And if I travel, it's not like I don't look at anything, but I don't really attend to it the same way. It's just, there's only so much time and so much attention that you can give to things. So I don't travel much. I mostly wander around here. But anything that's here, I'm interested in. That's what I decided. And the nice thing is we live far enough north that you can kind of pretend that you get to know almost everything. You can't really, but you can pretend like, it's not like we're in a tropical forest where there's 200 species of trees in an acre and you're like, oh, too much. But it's not just what's alive. For me, it's also the physical environment. What's Indian River doing? Medvedji Lake. I'll talk a little more about Medvedji Lake later. And just the rocks and all of the things here. So I just think of anything that's sharing this place, and there's a Tlingit philosophy that's everything has spirit, and I'm inclined to kind of embrace that as I in my approach here. So meeting the neighbors, the obvious way is probably to get introduced, and that certainly is helpful, and I'll speak more about that later. But I'll start here with what it kind of feels like when you're doing it on your own, perhaps. And one term I've heard is the wall of green. You look at that and you go, yeah, that's green. And I don't know how to make sense of that. There's just too much there. It's overwhelming. And so I asked the first questions, what stands out? Well, in this picture, those blue flowers, there's a lot of those. So if we look a little closer at those, we say, oh, blue flowers, well, that's interesting. And then all of these three are in that picture, but they look different. And they look different enough that I can go, once I kind of have keyed in on the blue flower, then I go, okay, well, these look pretty different and those look pretty different. And so that's how I kind of approach it. It's like, get familiar with something and then say, what looks different? And kind of branch out from there and slowly expand. This also brings up the question of, what is it that I'm doing to know what those things are? Am I identifying things? Sometimes I have to, or am I recognizing them? My guess is that you all know that's a bald eagle on the right. My guess is none of you had to really think about what that was. That you just go, oh, that's a bald eagle, of course. And if I ask you what it was and how you know, you'd say, well, it has a white head and, it's big old, and it just looks like an eagle. Like, what else would it be, right? Because that's what it is. We recognize it. You don't identify, well, maybe if you have face blindness, you have to identify people by field marks and those sorts of things. But when I see my family and friends, I know who they are. I don't really think about how I know who they are. It's just a sense of familiarity. So that's what I've always aimed for better and worse, is that sense of familiarity. On the left side, some of you may know what that is. Certainly, I would guess all of you recognize that as a bird. And maybe some of you are familiar enough with birds to go, oh, that's a little brown bird. And then you're good, right? That's good enough for you. And that's fine. If you want to go further, then you're starting to go, well, okay, look at the bill, and then you pull out your book and it has field marks, and then you're in this process of identifying, right? And so a lot of times when you're just learning something, like the hard part is figuring out what it is in the first place. And once you know what it is, then it's pretty easy. You start to recognize it. So in this case, we have, the bald eagle, we have a Swainson thrush, and then I didn't even mention the elderberries, but some of you probably recognize the elderberries. So it helps to know, having your space be localized helps. Because if I was considering all over the world, there might be other birds that, and certainly there are other birds that look like that. There's even other birds that look kind of like that here. But it's this process. So here, this, you go, well, doesn't look very big, and it's not. It's probably a couple feet tall, but it's got an awful lot of wood on it. So you're thinking, it's probably a stunted tree. And it is a stunted tree. And some of you might notice, oh, those needles, they're needle-like leaf things out there. And so that puts it into kind of our conifers. Maybe you just call it a pine tree, kind of generically. And some of you might be more familiar with our evergreen conifers here and go, oh, well, that's kind of a hemlock. And it turns out this is a mountain hemlock. I call this tree eagle dip bonsai. It is a mountain hemlock, and or scientific name Tsuga mertensiana. Eagle dip bonsai because it's by Eagle Dip Lake, which is an unofficial name, but seems to be pretty commonly used here. And it kind of gives me the feeling of a bonsai tree. So this one I recognize as an individual. If I were to see a picture of this, I'd go, oh, that's not just any tree, that's a particular tree. So there are different scales at which we might get to know something and learn to recognize it. But I am kind of assuming something here, and that's, what is a name in the first place, right? What are we talking about? Who or what is it? What's in a name? If you see all of these, if you grow up in Alaska, Southeast Alaska, you call them bear's bread. When mycologists come here, they're like, what the heck is bear's bread? And why does everybody call everything bear's bread? I took it for granted because, of course, it's bear's bread. That's what I learned, and that's what it's called. If you look in books, you won't find bear's bread anywhere. I don't know why it's called bear's bread, but that's what we call it. But it turns out, if from a scientific perspective, this is actually 3 different species here. At the top, we have Ganoderma applanatum, which is the one you can draw on, makes little stains on the underside. On the right, we have Fomitopsis munciae, which is red-banded polypore. You can see that kind of reddish band there. And then on the bottom, it's Fomitopsis acracia, and that's actually the most common one around here. It took me a while to figure that out because they were all bear's bread in my mind, and my mind didn't differentiate them. They all looked the same. I didn't even know they were different. And then as I started to learn, I was like, oh, there are differences here, and I can recognize them. But it does come down to what's the point, right? And, you don't necessarily need to know there are 3 different species. It makes numbers go up if you're keeping track of that, so that's handy. But for your purposes, maybe it doesn't matter. But if you want to leave messages to your friends on one, you want the one on the top. And so you want to learn how to recognize that one. But it is names are really fundamentally about ways that we make sense of the world. They didn't ask us what boxes we were going to make. So they do their own thing, and we make the boxes depending on purposes. These days, scientific names are mostly around phylogenetics. How are these things related? Common ancestry, all of that stuff. When I first met Kitty, she was like, scientific names, they're the best because they're stable. And yeah, that was just as genetics were starting to come in, and she backtracked on that in later years. It was like, yeah, common names are actually way more stable. They may not be regionally stable. You go, we call everything here bear's bread, but they don't elsewhere. But bear's bread's still bear's bread, 40 years later from when I first learned it. Meanwhile, all of those three names, or certainly the two Fomitopsis have changed because those were scientifically considered the same species for a while. And, in the last, I don't know when they split, but they used to be Fomitopsis panicola, and now they're just part of that group and they're considered separate species. Related, we're not the only folks that have lived here and have names for things. This is one that I appreciate. So Astagadli, and it's literally the cracker around the tree. How many of you are familiar with pilot bread? You know what pilot bread is? These round crackers like this, right? And they're kind of thick. Well, it turns out that, according to the notes in the dictionary that I have the link there for, this was originally called gat. And when pilot bread came around, they started calling pilot bread gat because it looks like a stack of, if you stack it up, it looks like that, right? And so then this became Astagadli, which is basically the cracker took on the main name, and then this got described as being the cracker around the tree. So there's lots of ways that we come up with names. Eagle Dip Lake I mentioned before, because every time I've been there, it seems like there's an eagle taking a bath in it. And I assume that's why other people had that experience and started calling it by that as well. So if you're interested in Tlingit names, there's a bunch of them in the dictionary and a lot of other stuff as well. I find it fascinating. So when you're learning to recognize those are those orchids again. Turns out those are the same species. They looked different to me. And so it's kind of like, well, how do you know? These are two, probably everybody here recognizes those, right? They're cats. They don't look the same. I mean, we're used to blending them and go, oh yeah, of course those are cats. And then you start to ask yourself, what's the difference between a cat and a dog? And you recognize it, but when you start to try and explain it to somebody, it might be a little different. Now, the differences between these cats might be really significant if you're looking for your cat. They look very different. It's pretty easy to recognize your cat if it's one of those and not the other one. But generally speaking, if we're just considering species, it's not so much that it matters. And when we're taught, especially at a young age, this is what a cat is, and we learn what a cat is, we learn to just blend all those things, and we don't even really think about how different things can be. And in our mind, when we're learning stuff in nature, we might want it to be the same if it's the same thing. And so I got frustrated with that sometimes over the years. And it was these things look different. Why are they the same? Well, it turns out it matters where you grow and all sorts of things. So this cycle of wall of green experience, finding something that makes sense out of it, looking at that, starting to grow sort of the things that look different. I repeat this, it cycles at different scales with different groups. Goals, not everybody's favorite, and in fact I still have to identify goals for the most part. There's some that I kind of recognize, but goals are challenging. There's a lot of variation within species, and then all this hybridization that happens. And then, at different scales. This is not quite the big meadow scale. We're looking at mosses here and a couple of small vascular plants, and just starting to figure it out. So that's kind of my approach personally, and I kind of do this, but there's a tremendous amount of help along the way. So one of those ways is, one of the helps is friends. Other friends get interested in other stuff. Paul Norwood here, some of you know him very well. He got interested in desmids. That's what these little microscopic things are called. A few years ago, and turns out Sitka is a good place for desmid diversity. I think Paul's got well over 100 species of desmids that he's found, sampling little bits of water from bogs and various other wet places, and then looking at them under the microscope. He's like, you should do desmids. And I finally got a microscope setup I was happy with, and so this last year or so I started doing desmids. And I've started started getting pictures and trying to figure out what they are. iNaturalist really helps because there's folks there that are interested. And then Paul's work previously really helps because he's already figured out what a lot of stuff is. And so I can kind of piggyback on what he's done. And that really accelerates the journey. So following friends is a great way to accelerate if that's what you're interested. Sharp-eyed spotters. You have to forgive the alliteration. I sometimes get carried away. And some of them are pretty forced. This one's all right. But so my kids, if you have children in your life, especially young children, they seem to love to find things. At least mine did. And if you let them know you're interested in things being found, then they will be happy to point them out to you. So Connor there on the lower left has a bird nest, which if I remember correctly, it's one he spotted while he was on the bus ride home. And then he's like, I saw a nest, can I go get it? And I was like, it was in the winter time, so the birds weren't going to use it. So I was like, sure. So he brought back the nest. Rowan is there holding, in her fleece there, holding the first tide pool sculpin that I have an observation of. I got a picture of it. She always liked me to take pictures of whatever she found. And her eyes were sharper and continue to be sharper than most. So in the upper left there, that's called a thrips. If you've worked in greenhouses, you might have heard of those. They can be pests there. But turns out they're really small. And she came up to me, she goes, I got something, you want to look at it? I'm like, sure. And she holds her finger and I look and there's her finger. And I'm like, what do you, no, she says, there's something on my finger. And I'm like, I can't really. So in that little sliver here, let's see where, yeah. So this little sliver here, so from this blue line to that blue line is 5 millimeters. So this length is less than a millimeter, so that's roughly the size of this. So when it was on her finger, I basically could not see it, but she saw it, she found it, and she wanted me to take pictures, so I did. And that is one of my, I think I only have 2 or 3 thrips pictures, because they're pretty tiny. They're both much larger now than those pictures, and continue to find me stuff, which I appreciate. This is my daughter here in the upper right with a snow sedge caddisfly that was, probably came out of Indian River. It was near there. And then Connor, this was last summer, we went to Sea Lion Cove, and he spotted this snowy plover, which is only the second record for Alaska, which was great for me. That's the rarest bird I've ever seen in Alaska, but he has 2 first state records that he's seen. So not so exciting for him, I guess, from a birding perspective. If you look really closely here, you can see the bird is right there that he's getting pictures of. But so that was, it's nice to have people that have better eyes, and some of that's just youth. My eyes, when I first met Katie, I remember we were looking at mosses and I'd hold it up to her and she'd like pull my hand back and I was like, what are you doing? I'd kind of laugh. She goes, your time's coming. Certainly it has. Now I have to hold things out here or wear glasses to see. But it also helps just having knowledge and knowing what to look for. The other thing here, some of you may remember Marla Stadine and Marge Ward. They had been birding by the time, I'm not quite as old as they were when they started birding. When I get to be that age, I've been birding longer than they were birding. It seemed like they'd been birding forever. They started in 1980. And I met them in the early 2000s at a Christmas bird count. And they kind of took me under their wing, no pun intended, or maybe it was, and just offered encouragement and kind of showed me the ropes of birding as a more broader communal activity. It turns out people want to see birds and people are willing to chase birds, and there's this whole culture around birding which has become more widespread, more known. Some of you may have seen the YouTube documentary Listers, which is a lot of fun if you haven't seen it, but this couple of guys that decided to try a bigger birding. We've done a number of seminars over the years. We did one that was kind of birding in Alaska. That picture was by Bill Foster, who is also very interested in birds. So this story here, on May 5th, 2005, I got this picture of a Hudsonian godwit down at Totem Park. It's an unusual bird here. I think there had only been a few reports of it. Now it seems like, my sense is now it's probably annual, but easily overlooked if you're not out all the time. We have more people out, so we're getting it reported more often. I saw one of those. I called them later in the day, and they're like, oh, did you see the red knot? And I was like, red knot? No, I know what's a red knot. So I looked at a red knot. So I went back down the next day. Unfortunately, it was still there. They aren't always. And so this was a red knot. And this is maybe what I saw, something like that, where I just didn't have my eyes weren't tuned well to what birds were different. So I was not making I was not distinguishing them very well. Now those 3 birds there in that little picture look obviously different to me. It's a red knot and a black turnstone and a black-bellied plover in the background. But at the time, I didn't know how to, my brain processing wasn't making sense of that. So it helps to have folks that are, kind and generous and also encouraging as you are learning things. And so I would visit them, not every week, but I'd visit them regularly and call them if I saw any birds, and they'd let me know what was going on. This was in the days, the internet email list things were starting to just show up, but they were out of that kind of older period where it was everybody, you had to be on the right people's phone list, otherwise you didn't hear about things. Going even further back in time, Sitka has a remarkable legacy of photography. Merrill, very well-known photographer, who passed away died in 1929. There's also all the Photoshop photos that started in the 20s, I think. Gilpatrick was the original person, and then up into the 70s. So a great archive, and I enjoy looking through some of those photos. I recognize this photo here, this old black and white, was part of the collection that was at Sheldon Jackson, so it's probably at the park now, because I think all those went there. And this I recognize as Medvici Lake, because I had been there and it was kind of distinctive. There's this tree, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun to go retake that photo and try and line things up and see how much it's changed. Oops, I changed that faster than I wanted to. So in 2003, I did that. I went back and I found, I lined everything up as best I could, and it seemed to me that this tree was now dead, and the base of it was in the water, and some of the branches even look pretty similar. I don't know when it flooded, but at some point the lake level rose. So this is the same 2 pictures. I've changed the newer one to black and white, and you can see there's the branches there that are going off, and it's definitely flooded. So I'm like, well, that's interesting. It has changed. That lake has changed. That's one of the things I've noticed as you go around, it just feels like things are kind of the same all the time. Because, from my human perspective, like this large landscape seems like it doesn't change that much. But as I spend more time, I know that it does, landslides, wind throws, those sorts of things. But a lake is a lake, right? How much could it possibly change? And so it's always fun for me to see these kind of examples where it's changed quite a bit. So last year, I heard from some friends that the lake had gone really low, and apparently does that most winters as it is colder and there's much less water coming into the lake. It's not a very big drainage. Most of the water is staying as snow up high and ice up high, and yet the water continues to drain out of the lake, so the lake level drops. So this is that same tree here on the right, much smaller. It's the top is broken off, those branches are pretty much gone, and you can see the roots going down. I made 2 visits last spring. This was the second one, and the lake level had risen. The first one that I went there, it was about 8 feet below the sort of spill level, if you will. And this was probably more like 4 feet. But you can see those roots are still going into the water. They wouldn't have gone into the water originally. So the lake level when this tree grew was lower. And so the first time I visited Medvici Lake was in 1992, probably, kind of roughly, or maybe, yeah, probably roughly around there. Maybe, I think probably fall of 1992. And at the outflow, there was a massive log jam. And, if you've ever been up there, before 2020, I guess that's when it blew out. You saw that massive log jam. There's like canoes stuck in it. It was a mess. And from talking to the guys that work at Medvici, when that blew out, the river started becoming much more flashy. So it actually created this kind of system that kept the damper system essentially on the lake. They would rise slowly and allow water to come through, but it couldn't scour out there. Also within the last few years, there's a big debris flow, like rock, that came down into the lake there. And so that got me thinking, and so I bet what happened is there was a big debris flow that jammed up the front of the lake. A lot of logs came into the water and then made that log jam, and then that kept that rock from being eroded out by the river. So I'll be interested to see if I live long enough, if that starts eroding back. Now that log jam is gone, last year I went and looked, and the downhill part of that is starting to erode back. So as that cuts back, it may in fact drop the lake level again to what it was, in Merrill's time. I don't know if I'll live that long, but I'm at some time between Merrill, who died in 1929, and that picture that I took in the first time I was there in the early 90s, the lake level rose. And so I don't know if anybody had been there. I talked to one person that grew up here and hadn't spent any time up at Medvici when he was a kid, but given the state of the tree when I took pictures in 2003, it probably couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 years. So I'm guessing sometime in the 70s. Otherwise that tree would have been a lot more rotten and more like it looks now. So that's just a guess though. I'm curious about it if folks have been up there. And then encounters with expertise. Of course, the nicest way to learn about new stuff is to talk to people that know a lot of stuff or know a lot about a particular group of things. And so Ron Hamill was somebody that came here to give a talk. I don't remember, I think Kitty might have met him at a NAMA conference, a mycological conference, and invited him to come give a talk. And he spent 3 days here. And she always was, she was busy and I was obsessed, so she would pawn them off on me to take them around. And I always liked going with them. It was a little like drinking from a fire hose sometime, just because they knew so much and they could just say what stuff was. But I tried to pick up as much as I could when I had that chance. Ron Hamill was one. Derek Sykes, entomologist from the university, his first trip to Sitka was to give a talk here. I think it might have even been that talk. He was looking at these Aegialides debilis, which is a little beetle. It's probably, like about that big, maybe 1.5 centimeters or so. And it lives on the beach, or it lives at the very upper part of the upper tidal. If you look there, and it's kind of right around where just you get a few salt-tolerant plants, but not much. And you start prying cracks apart, you'll start finding these beetles, you start finding their larvae. But they seem to be flightless. And so then the question is, how are they getting around? They were doing a population study, looking at the genetics, seeing is there more than one species? If it's all one species, then how do they seem to be related? Are they mixing all the time? And if so, how? Because there's a big gap between here and the Aleutians, and they're finding all of these beetles all the way along. Or I don't remember the exact distribution of them, but that was one of the things that they were studying. So I would have never even thought to look for beetles in the rocks at the beach, but turns out there's beetles in the rocks at the beach. So that's always kind of fun. Jim Bastel came and gave talks. He's well-known retired geologist for the Forest Service and has come to Sitka many times. But he's the first person that pointed out glacial striations to me. He came and gave a talk. He was actually at the park, and he's like, gray rock isn't good for much. It's kind of boring, doesn't have all the interesting stuff geologists like. Some geologists liked it, I think, but he didn't. But it does hold striations, that's what he said. So you can go and you can find these striations, these scratches in the rock where the glaciers ran over. And so that inspired me to start looking around at glacial striations and start thinking about that. This Acrobulbus ciliatus is another one, not related to a speaker for this series, but this is known from, I think, Asia. There's a population in the Appalachians. It's been found on Attu, which is the very far end of the Aleutians, and it's been found here. It had been found here, and actually last year or the year before, it was found on the outer coast of Glacier Bay. But there's a guy named Ian Worley who did his PhD work here on the bryogeography of Southeast Alaska, is what he called it. He looked at mosses and liverworts, and he spent a lot of time in the field. And he actually found this. The notes for the location were like Sawmill Creek, Blue Lake area. So it was kind of like, well, all right, that's sort of helpful. I mean, it narrows it, but not that much. And this guy who's in Glacier Bay now is really doing a lot of work on liverworts in Southeast Alaska. And he says, you should go look for this. Worley found it. He didn't realize he'd found it. It was found in his collections later. Somebody was looking through them. So he didn't report it, but it was known from here based on his collections. And I had some ideas based on the sort of habitat it liked to grow. I had some ideas of where to go look. And actually, Paul Norwood's the one that found this. We went to where I thought it might be, and he's the one that spotted it. So again, sharp eyes. Sharp-eyed spotters are helpful. This is small. The total length of that photo is probably 1 inch. So these are quite small. But also it's like, why is this in the Appalachians, in Asia, and in Sitka and Glacier Bay and Attu? You know, maybe it's in between in places, maybe it's not, hard to know, but a lot of people have been looking a lot of places. And so just mysteries, but I would have never even like known. Like I wouldn't have gone to that spot where it was found to look, most likely, and who knows if I ever would have spotted it. But I want to spend just a little extra time with one person, Encounters with Expertise, Jason Briner, who is pictured in each of these 3 photos. On the left, Jim Bachtel actually introduced us. Jason and his grad student Caleb, they're on the left, were in Sitka hoping desperately that the weather lifted enough for them to get a helicopter ride to South Baranof. The helicopter had to come from Juneau, so it wasn't just Sitka that had to have clear weather, it was also Juneau. And they had a limited time and they desperately wanted to get their collection. What they are doing, what Caleb was working on for his master's project, was exposure dating. They get, in this photo here, you can see Jason is working with another graduate student showing her how to run the angle grinder. And then this rock here is a granitic erratic. So the glaciers came and left it there, essentially. So what they do is they sample that and they're able to tell how long it's been exposed to cosmic rays. And that gives them a sense of when the glaciers retreated. So they're asking questions. In particular, they were wondering, Jason and Caleb were looking at South Baranof because that had been proposed as a site that there was a glacial refugia. And so they wanted to see if there was evidence of that in this exposure datings. And what they found is, at least at elevations that are currently above sea level, it was all under the ice. But while they were waiting, they didn't have much to do, and they had to wait, I think, 2 or 3 days. And so I helped them get over to cruise off. They went over there twice, got a ride over with Scott MacArthur one day, and then Kitty LeBounty took us over another day. And so they were going to sample some of these basalt flows. This was at Fred's Creek. This one here, Jason wanted to demonstrate pillow lava for his students, and so made a nice, he said, take a picture of me with my head on the pillow. So it was nice. I've had a chance to spend some time out in the field last summer with them, and also they've come back to Sitka several times doing projects, and hopefully we'll give a talk for this seminar based on some of the results that they've got in the coming years. So I'm not going to go into all of this. If you're curious about it, in fact, I'm just going to even just briefly mention it. If you're curious about that, QR code will take you to a page that I set up on my site, just like pulling together all the photos and stuff that I have taken and all the questions and thoughts that I have about it as a very much non-expert. But the Encounter with the Expertise basically opened up this whole thing of like, oh, I can look at these stuff. A lot of this stuff's just on the surface. I don't really know what's going on, but I can ask questions as well as anybody. And the core question is, what plausible story or stories would explain what's observed along the eastern shoreline of Kruzof Island and nearby areas of Sitka Sound? So for my purposes, that goes from, this is, for those of you who are familiar, this is Port Crest off up here, Point Brown, coming around Kamino Point, I guess that one's Inner Point, Fred's Creek, Shoals Point, all the way around to Sitka Point. I've been along most of that shoreline, on the beach for a lot of it, and then towards Sitka Point just on the boat. So these are just a few of the things that I noticed. There's this Mountain Point sea stack. And you go, well, if glaciers ran over that, it certainly wouldn't be there, right? So something was protecting it from the glaciers. They think the glaciers came down there, and it seems like they probably did, but what was there that the glaciers didn't knock that thing over? And, this Inner Point erratic, well, this is my son standing next to a rock. That's too big for it to come in on, like the logs. A tree root will grow around a rock, but not that big. That'd be a pretty big tree. So where did that come from? Jason and Jim have different ideas. Jim thinks it was rafted in on icebergs. Jason thinks it's leftover glacial till. So like a moraine or something got there and all the fine stuff got washed away. And it's easy when you're seeing it there right on the shore. You go, oh, well, yeah, iceberg makes sense. But then you got to think about sea level. And what was sea level doing since the last ice age? We all probably have heard that sea level was much lower when all the water was locked up in ice, and then it came back up. And actually, Swan Lake was was a tidal area, and so there's marine sediments in the bottom of Swan Lake. So it was actually around Sitka about 10 meters higher than it is now, the highest sea level. So then you start having to ask, well, what timing would allow that to have been iceberg versus versus erratic. And like in my mind, I'm like, well, if we could tell where that rock came from, if it came from like the Silver Bay side, then that suggests it wasn't, the glaciers probably didn't come across the sound. They probably went out that deep trench out there. So, you know, there's ways that people that have actual expertise could answer some of these questions. They certainly aren't going to be me. The other thing that's interesting about Interpoint is if you've been by there, see there's this kind of peak that's in the middle of this big flat. And that's graywacky. So it's the stuff that's around town. It's not the basalt that surrounds it. And there's actually glacial striations on that graywacky that seem to be eroding out of the basalt. So then that raises the question of like, well, did the glaciers were they there? And then, you know, if it is eroding out of the basalt, that means the basalt came after the glaciers, but that basalt is supposed to be older, and it looks like it was in the water, and again, we have sea level issues, so it's like, when could that have possibly been? Maybe those striations are from the prior ice age, and that was all buried in basalt for 100,000 years or something, and it's just now eroding out due to the wave action and that kind of thing. There's so many questions that I have that I can't answer, but I enjoy thinking about them. And for me, it's part of getting to know the neighbors in this kind of general way. Mount Edgecombe ash is another one. Jason's graduate student a couple years ago sampled Necker Bay, at the mouth of Necker Bay and also at the upper end of Necker Bay, and found there was a 3,000 year difference in the ages of the rock, the exposure dating there. So in other words, the ice retreated from the mouth of Necker Bay 3,000 years before it last left the upper end of of Necker Bay, this little south on Baranof Island, maybe, I don't know, maybe 20 miles south of here, something like that. So that was interesting. 3,000 years is a long time by our standards. Geological standards, not so much. They also, as part of that project, that year they sampled over in Baranof Lake. So they did cores at Baranof Lake, they did exposure dating, and those dates corresponded more with the younger dates of Necker Bay, so like the upper Necker Bay part. Then they looked at records where people had looked for ash and found it versus didn't find it. And there was this intriguing pattern of gaps in ash where like the ash should be there based on where else it was and wind, but there wasn't. And so they came up with this hypothesis that there was an ice cap on Baranof Island that lasted an extra 3,000 years, basically, after the main retreat, after Chatham Strait had cleared out and the main continental ice sheet had left, that there was a persistent ice cap for some length of time. And the timing of it just happens to correspond with when Mount Edgecombe was active with this bright orange ash layer that we're so familiar with. And so when I was thinking about that and talking with Jason about it, and I was like, that's interesting. That's easy to look for, right? Just go along the road and see where there's ash and see where there's not ash. And I realized that, you know, just going out, say Sawmill Creek, cross the bridge at Sawmill Creek, you're onto the dirt road. As you're going along there, this picture here on the left was taken along that section of road. There's a nice ash deposit there. It looks like it's in layers, like it wasn't mixed up and deposited later, probably fell in that way. You go around, you keep going around, you go past the little climbing place there, and you make that sharp turn. If you're familiar, this is where people go down to the nets. And you make that sharp turn and you're coming into Herring Cove. And if you look on the bank there, this is undercut here. Right above this is the organic layer. It's all glacial till. There's no ash there. And so then that's weird. Why is there no ash there? And then I thought about it. I'd spent time up on the uplands between Beaver Lake and Silver Bay. There's no ash up there either that I've ever seen. And there's lots of flat stuff there. There's ash on Verstovia on steep hills. There's ash on Harbor Mountain. So it's not about steepness or lack thereof. It's just there doesn't seem to be any ash there. So makes me wonder, and then this one, which this is a really nice picture of like glacial till and then the layers of ash. This is further out Green Lake Road. After you get past Herring Cove and you're back on the road going out Silver Bay, there's ash again. And so makes me wonder, was the ice still coming out of Blue Lake? You know, what now is Blue Lake, that may have still been filled with glacier up to Beaver Lake and coming over into Herring Cove, essentially. When the ash landed, it landed on ice, and as that ice was moving and melting, it didn't accumulate, it didn't have these layers. But Bear Mountain was a big barrier. And so last summer when Jason was here, we had a chance to drive out to Green Lake, and we looked along the way. And there are places along the way between Herring Cove and Bear Cove where there's ash. And there's some ash. I'm not an expert in it, so I can't tell. Some of it may have been reworked. So in other words, maybe it landed up higher and fell down. It was hard to tell. But definitely as you're going to Green Lake, there's no ash again, and it's all just this glacial till. So these are all, pointing towards this possibility that when the volcano was erupting, there was ice there still, which is much later than, the big retreat of the ice. So I've made up this QR code takes you to the page that I wrote up with mostly pictures and just questions there. So all of this is stuff that, I would have never thought to look for any of this, but that those conversations with Jason and the chance to spend some time with him, I'm like, well, this is easy stuff to look at, but I didn't even know, I didn't have a context to make sense of it, and so having that context is really helpful. So the thing I want to, that ended up not being quite right there, but pulling in perspectives. So folks that I work with, some have, I don't know who might have said this originally, but it's commonly said there, tractor school, for folks that have heard of tractor school and Tom Brown Jr. One who tracks alone is always right. And that's the advantage of being by yourself. You get to decide and nobody's going to tell you otherwise. I really learned that, over the years, I had a very photographic, kind of holistic, I'm trying to recognize things, approach to things. Kitty had an approach that was much more, she was a trained botanist, and you need to identify things and look at the key and look at the descriptions and all of that. And so sometimes I would bring her things and say, what is this? Because it's a lot easier for somebody else to identify things than it is for me. And she would go through the work of identifying it, and then she would tell me, and then I'd look at the name on the internet and look at all the pictures I could find, and I'd go, but it doesn't look like that. And I think, sometimes she was right and sometimes I was right. But that process of discussion, we'll call it discussion. Sometimes it was a vigorous discussion about that, and I imagine there was some eye rolling about, why are you even asking me if you're going to disagree with me all the time? But when I started working on iNaturalists or doing stuff on iNaturalists and putting names on things, there was, from time to time, there would be somebody who would post something and it wasn't right. They had a wrong name on it, and they'd say, well, I keyed this out. And I'm like, well, I don't know what to tell you. It's not right. But they were working on their own. They didn't have that opportunity to kind of have that push-pull of like different perspectives. The perspective of the beginner is, I couldn't think of any specific examples off the top of my head, but I know there's been many times over the years that somebody will send me a message or run into me in town and say, oh, I saw this thing. I wonder about it, and it's something I'd never heard of, never even thought about. But it gives me an opportunity to look at things. So pulling in all of these different perspectives is, part of what this is about for me, kind of building the community in that way. And then, like I said earlier, more eyes means seeing more stuff. So, it's not unusual. There's nothing quite as frustrating as finding out about a rare bird 4 days after because people thought it wasn't a big deal. And, oh, it just was another bird. Yeah, but it wasn't just another bird. It was a really unusual bird. So I always try to encourage people and pass on really, the gifts I was given by people who have helped me along the way. So for me in the end, it's kind of these threads of connection, revisiting friends. This is the Eagle Dip bonsai. Unfortunately, the next year, after I got that picture, I revisited, and the needles were dead. When I visited again, they were gone. So this tree is still there in form, but at some point will rot away. And so there's a certain amount of sadness that comes, from revisiting and seeing the changes and knowing that's the way that we all go. But it is part of the process. But also this week, yellowlegs have returned, and so each year, you have the excitement of birds and plants and renewing acquaintances is how I like to describe it. I go out, and many species I try to see every year. Sometimes that means hiking up a mountain, whatever it means to go. That's just part of what I do and part of how I enjoy and appreciate getting to know the neighbors here. So I just want to finish with, for me, there's a lot about gratitude and connection here. It's the place that holds us all, in the big scheme of things, it's galaxy, universe, solar system, all of that. But more specifically, it's Sitka, this place. And so it's great the way that, many of us appreciate being here and living here, and that's why we put up with Marches that have way too much snow and rain, and Aprils and Mays and early Junes like last year, that some of us might remember less fondly than others. But it's an amazing place. We have neighbors, both the people, well, I include people separately, but our broad sense, these neighbors and the people, and then all the stories. And so if you didn't get a chance to look, there's a couple of posters back there that I made for the State of the Sound, which yay for Ellen and Lauren who helped get that going. It was something that I'm really glad is getting started. So it talks about some of the things, both the iNaturalist stuff that other people are doing. Paul, Karen Johnson, Roland Worth are doing amazing stuff there, finding things and documenting the diversity, documenting our neighbors here in Sitka. So I always appreciate all of that and just all the stories that come out of it. And so I'm not going to read this because I don't think I can do it without getting choked up, but I'll let you read it if you like. And this is my appreciation to Kitty. And with that, I'll take any questions, if anybody has any.
So Matt,
Yeah.
where did you spot the yellow legs?
Those the yellow legs I saw were at Halibut Point Rec, but there's also been some at Totem Park. So out on the beach at Totem Park is one of the best places to see them. Also, sometimes I haven't seen any out at Stargaven yet, but that's another good place to see them. They like the estuaries and tide flats. Yeah.
I was wondering, so iNaturalist, which you didn't say was probably a mobile app.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah.
But that was my question. No, so like, how much of identification works backwards now, where so many people make observations that you get a mass of critical mass on the internet, and somebody else realizes that there's now a subspecies delineation between all those observations.
So one of the challenges doing this talk was that each little section I could have spent a whole hour on, and nobody wanted to stay for all of that, including me. So, but that's the really interesting thing. So iNaturalist, yes, there is a mobile app for iNaturalist. It's very helpful. I also use the website interface a lot. There's a remarkable amount of science being done. The volume of data that's coming in, biodiversity data that's coming in into iNaturalist. There's species that were new species that are there. People say like, that's not a species we've ever seen before. There's rediscovered species that were thought to be extinct that show up on there. There's a lot of work. And the interesting, like in the old days, what people had was collections. A lot of times those were in alcohol or pressed plants or things like that. And you lose something. Like in alcohol, you lose the color, or formaldehyde, whatever you're storing in. So like some creatures, marine creatures. I remember Aaron Baldwin telling me this when we were teaching at SJ together. He goes, some of these animals aren't that hard to identify when you see them fresh, because they have different colors that fade when they're preserved. And so then the technical information ends up being these obscure things that are really hard to tell. And so with the volume of photos, and it's even more than that, it's that the AI is starting to, like iNaturalist has visual AI thing that is able to actually tell you pretty well what most certainly common species are. So a lot of people are just using that if you want to know what something is. Some of you maybe are familiar with Merlin through Cornell Labs and eBird. It does pretty well. Take a picture or let it listen. It's not 100%, and so it's good to do that. And for me, part of it is I like to know what stuff is, and I didn't mention it, but I kind of got obsessed with the list and that kind of thing, and making numbers go up is kind of motivating for me, even though it's not the reason I do it. It is motivating in the moment. And there's a risk, there's a downside to sort of the reliance on the AIs, right? Because this just gets easy and you just get the instant answer and you don't have to wonder, you don't have to think. So, but yeah, that was more than you asked about. But the short answer to what you ask is, yeah, there's definitely the amount of information that's coming in, and scientists like taxonomists and stuff are working with that and are using it to inform. I don't think it's only that, they have to do other work also, but informing where to collect and where to sample and do that more technical, lab work.
And if you upload to iNaturalist, it'll be a couple days.
Oh, I've slowed down a lot. I started getting too
good.
grumpy at people when I was looking at too many pictures. That some of the tourists like to take pictures of gulls that are a quarter mile away with their cell phones and then post a bunch of pictures like that. And I was like, nobody needs me to be grumpy about this. So I slowed down a little bit. But I used to look at all the observations pretty much every day that would come in. I'm a little slower now. I focus mostly on Sitka, but yeah, I do. And there's more than just me. There's a lot of people that are very actively identifying. That's another nice part of it. So it's a nice way to learn, and sometimes young kids like teenagers, they get obsessed with something and it's their thing. iNaturalist is like, they can get pretty intense there, and in a good way. Like they really get into something, and they have access to like the world experts in a group, and then they have access to thousands of photos that they just start reviewing, like going through and trying to understand what things are and identifying things. And it is interesting. Sometimes they'll come back in a few years and they'll change IDs because they've learned a lot in them. But it's for the young people that have that inclination, it's an amazing opportunity for them to really get into it. And I suspect there's a new generation of taxonomists that's probably emerging out of iNaturalist.
How many bears have you seen?
How many bears have I seen? I could probably count the number of bears I've actually seen. When I was on, it's harder because I did see some, I've seen them from the boat, but I have not seen very many bears. I would guess less than 50 bears total in all the time I'm out wandering around. And some of that's like going to Stargavin specifically to look for them. But I'm happy to not see them. One day, it was a summer day, I was going out to Medvici Lake actually. I was riding my bike out there and there was a bear in the middle of the road up in front of me, and I was like, it's such a nice day, I don't want to turn around. I'll just stand here and watch it. And so I stood there and watched it, and it walked into the bushes. And I was like, okay. I waited, and I thought I heard a crunch like it was walking away. And so I didn't ride my bike, but I walked my bike up there. And as I was walking by, I kind of looked in the bushes, and I saw it was only about this far in the bushes. Like it was just in the bushes. And I was like, well, what am I going to do? I just kept walking. Because at that point, there wasn't anything else to be done. But it did make me realize if I hadn't known that bear was there and looked for it and I'd just gone riding by it, I had no idea. So I suspect bears have seen me a lot more than I've seen them. And fortunately, I haven't had any encounters with bears, but that were serious. Plenty of people have. But yeah, I'm maybe a little too lackadaisical about bears, but they're part of the territory, I guess. But I don't seek them out for sure.
They're our neighbors.
Yeah, they are definitely for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I have two questions. One, what is the funniest or like weirdest thing people mess up on iNaturalist when they come here?
Oh, when they come here?
Yeah, and then I have my second question, is a science question, but you can answer that one.
What do people mess up on? The AI has gotten good enough that they don't tend to mess up too much these days. The funniest one that I saw was an observation from Haynes, and the initial identification was a gunnel, which for those of you who don't know, it's a little fish that lives you find it in the intertidal sometimes, blennies or eels. They look kind of eel-like, not technically an eel. But so that was the identification that was given for it. It was an earthworm. It was in a pot, like it was in a pot, like they'd lifted up the pot, and I think it was on the ground there. And I was like, how did that happen? And they had just trusted the AI. And as I thought about it, like they probably don't know what a gunnel is, and they're just not looking. They don't bother to. It's like, okay, computer said so. All right, we'll just go with that. And so if you use the AI, and it can be helpful. At least do a little bit of due diligence to make sure that it's within the ballpark. Because if you'd have looked and said, well, it's clearly not a fish, you found it in a potted plant. So so that was probably the most ridiculous one that I've seen. But yeah, I can't think of anything like that was kind of people messing up on here. Well, I guess the one thing is people like to make observations of the flowers along the seawalk that are all planted, mostly or have been planted, And so they're a whole variety of not wild things, I should say. And so a lot of times people identify those as the wild, like there's geraniums and they'll identify them as the wild geraniums. But that's an easy mistake to make if you're just visiting and don't realize that landscaping's a thing, I guess. But and then
Okay, my other question was, so if the ash from Mount Edgecote fell onto the ice cap, like, it's still there.
but it's not going to settle down in the same way. It's going to get moved,
So
transported by
let that
water and
all
ice.
just like went into the ocean?
Yeah, and then just like any sediment, that's my understanding. Is basically the ice is still moving when it's in a glacier, and then as it's melting out and eroding, it just gets transported along with all the other stuff. So it would be in the mix of a glacial till, for example, presumably, but not in those nice layers that we see otherwise. Yeah. Any other questions?
How long did it take to get to 3,000?
Well, it depends on how you want to count, right? Because part of it's, like I have observations of things even now from years ago that somebody will put a name on and it's a new species for me suddenly because, I didn't know what it was. So that's, iNaturalist is thank you. iNaturalist is nice that way that you have this archive of stuff. So I don't know when I actually got, but the first ones were 1998. That's my oldest observations.
You have to work really hard to get them now that you've got so many. Like, well, I've already seen that. I can't add it.
Well, because of how I'm approaching it, for me, it's not just about the overall number, but every year I like to get 1,000 species, for example. So, and the first, I didn't talk about that, but the first time I tried to get 1,000 species was in 2007. I think I got like 300. I tried again in 2012 and did better. Part of the challenge is just the bookkeeping, right? iNaturalist made that so much easier. Paul did a big year thing in 2015. I was like, oh, that's the way to go when I saw how it worked for him. So after that year, so that 2017 was the first year that I did iNaturalist. Like that was what I poured my energy into. And that was the first year I got to 1,000 species in a year. And since then, I've done it almost every year since and I worked hard in 2017. But as you get to know things, now you know what they are, right? It's a lot easier. But getting to 3,000, it's not that, all I'd have to do is go for one dive or one snorkel and I'd find something that I hadn't seen before. There's mosses. There's big groups that I haven't really looked at. Collecting some water samples from Swan Lake or Muskeg Pond and getting desmids. There's, the easily probably many dozens of those that I don't have. So it's not that hard to find new stuff when you look in new groups. Finding a new bird, I'm lucky to get one of those a year. So far every year I've gotten at least one new bird, but one of these years I'm not, And so hasn't happened yet, but I expect it will happen before too long. So yeah, there is a drop off, but that's encourages me to expand into new groups and that way. So like I say, I think probably there's easily another couple thousand species collectively. We have 4,600 and some for Sitka, and Paul and others are finding a bunch diving, and there's lichens and liverworts and mosses. I'm guessing there's probably, I think we have maybe 300 lichens. There's probably 700 in Sitka, at least, species. They're difficult to identify, so that slows us down a bit too. So I haven't run out yet, let's put it that way.
I'm trying to imagine your hiking pace.
Slow. Paul over here somehow manages to cover ground just about, yeah. I can turn 100 yards into an all-day affair. I try not to. Part of it is like, well, if I want to get up a mountain, if I want to go up Bear Mountain because there's stuff up there, then I gotta get up the hill. But I'm of a vintage now where that's not as fast as it used to be either. So it's good to have an excuse to stop and look at things. Some people are able to just take pictures and go. I'm fussy about photos, so that really slows me down. But yeah, I can go up and down Bear Mountain in a day and do a couple hundred observations along the way. But yeah, definitely some people I think have challenges when they have a mismatch, I guess, let's put it that way. If they go with somebody that likes to do iNaturalist and they aren't an iNaturalist person, maybe. There can be conversations that ensue about pace and whose pace should be preferred. But yeah, I can go as slow as anybody, for sure. Yes?
Not a question, but I will say I am honored that you actually corrected one of my.
Oh.
I was like, who is this? I'm like, oh, it's Matt.
Yeah.
I was wrong, and thank you.
Oh, I don't even remember. What was it?
Gooseneck barnacles.
Oh, yeah.
I thought they were pelagic ones. I found them on a buoy when I was camping on cruise off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And they turned out to not be the.
I think you just said you got the genus right, but maybe not the species.
Oh, yeah, that's one. So I was going to be surprised if I actually put a name on those, because those are one was like, it's easy to tell that they're a pelagic gooseneck barnacle, but then it turns out there's like 4 or 5 species or something like that, and I'm like, I don't see them often enough to have gotten familiar. So again, it's that kind of scale and like getting to know things. Sometimes you can recognize somebody. You just think about the people that you're like, oh, you're part of that family. I don't know what your name is, but I recognize the family resemblance, So there's a certain amount of that happens. And when you travel, that happens as well. I don't travel much, but I know that was something that Kitty would talk about. She liked doing iNaturalist when she was traveling, and she'd be like, oh, this is in that family. It looks like. Every once in a while, somebody will tag me and say, what is this? And they're in like Eastern United States. I'm like, I have no idea. I've never been there. But it looks most like this thing that I'm familiar with, So there's a certain amount of that. But because my geographical range is so limited, my knowledge is limited by this. Like, I know what's here, but when you go away from here, there are other things that look similar that I haven't learned to distinguish. So I try to be pretty careful about that. So don't ask me what you found in Washington. I probably don't know. But if you found it here, there's a good chance I might recognize it.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I have never used iNaturalist, and I'm wondering, to picture something, you're not, you usually have to key things out.
Yeah, that's the old way.
So if somebody takes a picture, they only have a part of the plant. They don't have the root system. They don't have, so how can you tell what something is?
This was the very different perspectives that Kitty and I brought from where we came from. She came from botany, and that's what you did. You learned stuff, you keyed it out, you looked at all the characters. I came in with sort of this baseline belief that most things are recognizable once you know what they are. The challenge is getting to know what they are in the first place, but once you know what they are, and there was a lot of plants Kitty didn't bother to key out because she knew what they were. But if I showed her something she didn't know what it was, she always wanted to work through the keys. The keys are sort of an artificial thing, though, right? They're like what, and it depends on what you're keying out. If you only have 5 things versus all of North America things, then what needs to be in the key is different because it may be that with these 5 things that live here, you don't have to look at that much. But when you include all the stuff from everywhere, so like you're a Flora of North America kind of key, then you need all of those characters, because that's what separates one of these 5 from one of these other things over here.
But you're identifying new species, right? You said you're identifying new species.
I would not say I'm identifying new species.
Somebody is, based on picture.
They are, yeah, but part of that is we're learning the differences. We're learning, because we have high quality photography now, and we have so much of it, it's easier to compare in ways. Like when you were looking at when the people that made the keys were looking at herbarium sheets, and the assumption was that anybody that was going to be doing this was working with a collection and was going to be keying it out based on a collection. And you only had a limited sort of set of things to even build that key off of in the first place. But now it's not unlimited, but it's like hundreds and thousands of photos of things. And so like the insect people, there's a couple of, I said young people, I thought they were like professors or something. Turned out they were high school students that started doing this insect guide, and they were looking at the primary literature about flies. They were really interested in flies. And now I think this was a few years ago, now they are going into professional like entomology as this. And they were finding, they were doing that, they were viewing the pictures, they were seeing what they could tell, what they couldn't tell. Then they started looking at collections and saying, okay, what are some characters that, whoever happened to make, each key that somebody does is different, right? They aren't all the same characters. So there's different ways that you can kind of look at things. And so I never learned to key. I'm having to do some keying with mosses and liverworts. I'd hoped for years that Kitty would do all that identifying for me. Turns out it's really hard and takes a lot of time. So in the last few years, I've started to work on those. And so that's been my experience with keys. And mosses and liverworts are smaller, but most of the time things look different in a way that it's not necessarily easy to put in a key, even though they're obviously different. One way that I might analogize it is like most of us who aren't, I guess face blindness is its own thing, but most of us can recognize people pretty easily. But like, how would you describe that in a key to like key two different people apart? Like the kind of things that you would look at might not be the easiest, like it might be obvious if you just look at them, but not in ways that you can easily describe. And easily put in that sort of dichotomous key framework. And so that's my best answer to that, is that that was a product of sort of what was available at the time and how people had to work on things. Just like in the old days, when birding first started, the old school ornithologists were like, you can't identify a bird unless you shot it and have it in the hand. And that was what it was. There was no way of identifying birds other than that and being sure that you had what you thought you had. Then Peterson came along with his kind of field guides and his field marks. And that's just accelerated again with modern digital photography. I mean, you want to get esoteric into things. They're looking at like the particular rows of feathers and being able to tell how old, aging birds as juveniles, males, females, all this very kind of minutia, because they have high quality digital photos that they're able to do this with, that they might have been able to do, they could do with birds in the hand before, they're now able to do with just photos. And so it's just as the tools change, the ability of people to, and now because of that, they're also finding ways to distinguish species that, because you can look at a whole bunch of pictures of a whole bunch of different birds. There's only so many birds you have in a collection. You're not going to shoot all of them. And so in that respect, you had some limits, and there's people finding new ways to identify things based on the photos that weren't possible, from the collections. And so, depends on who you talk to as to whether that's good or not, and it depends on the group also. And these days with genetics, it's all kind of a crapshoot anyway. It's kind of like with a lot of the fungi, the mushrooms, they're doing they're just defaulting to well, we need to get DNA on that. And then they're going to hope that they're able to recover morphological things that you can see in a picture or even in a microscope or whatever. But there's so many cryptic species in some groups, and based on how we identify species. So it gets a little murky. Is I guess what I say, and I'm not a taxonomist. I like to make the number go up, but at the end, I also like to be able to call things something, right? That's what gets frustrating for me. They're like, well, these are the same or these are different, and we know they're different, but we don't have a name for them yet, and so you can't call them anything. At least not on iNaturalist. So I can call them what I want to on my own. But so it kind of depends on what your purpose is and sort of what your standard of separation, how you make the boxes. So. Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in what I can point my grandkids to sort of get them going with this kind of observation and curiosity. I can recall a book put out by then Life magazine about, I guess it was about geology, but one thing that I just fastened onto there was the traces left behind by glaciers.
Oh yeah.
And the U shape of a glacier valley that's been all carved out. And my cousin and I just went through that book just with great fascination when we were well before our teens. So that's going to be in the late 40s. And I've been looking for traces of glaciers ever since. I've seen the U-shaped valleys on the north slope of the Brooks Range, and glacial striations in Karelia, it's Russian now, but like Finland, and all that sort of thing. And so, but now I guess most of those sources that you can plug the kids into are digital.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the kids, right? And what they're interested in. But there's a lot of stuff online. My kids are older enough now that I haven't really looked at that as much. Honestly, for me, here, I just told them I wanted to see stuff. They liked catching things. They liked catching sculpins in the tide pools, and they liked finding, my daughter really liked moths and finding caterpillars, and so she was always looking for caterpillars. And I learned a lot about moths from her when she was this tall, just because she figured out how to find them, because she was interested. And so part of it is just their natural curiosity, and because I was interested in everything, then it didn't matter what they found. I was interested in hearing about it. So, but yeah, it depends on what they're into. It's often easier to have something that they're already a little interested in, but also if you're excited and interested in it and just telling them about it and telling them stories of places that you've been and the glacial striations and imagining in your mind, like that's one of the things I like to do here is like, all right, so this was all, like, Baranof Island's big enough that the continental ice didn't really overrun it around here, so all of the glaciers that came out through here would have come from the mountains that are right behind town, and just like the immense amount of ice that was there, Indian River Valley stacked up with 3,000 feet of ice coming out into the sound. And you can find those striations. Like I said, there's striations by the Russian blockhouse. There's really deep grooves there that are going west, that pointing towards Mount Edgecombe. And it's like one of the grooves is kind of like this big, so it's like a big boulder that went through there. And so it's just, to me, it's fascinating. And if you have that enthusiasm, and then just sharing that with them, that can be infectious as well. So. But it is getting late. I know I'm happy to answer more questions, but maybe we should let folks go that want to go, and I can answer.